Tell your stories about Freddy Krueger.
My first really significant encounter began innocently. I was back in my childhood bedroom, the one I grew up in. It looked a little bit off. Everything seemed slightly too bright and cheerful, with a slight undertone of sadness. But the familiar setup of my toys, stuffed animals lining the shelves, the colorful walls and rug was the one I remember. Then, I turned towards my old toy box. It sat in the corner of the room as it always had, and I started hearing a giggle come from its direction. I ignored it at first, because what kind of childish fear would this be, when suddenly a clawed hand emerges from beneath the lid. It wasn't metal. Instead, it looked like blackened wood that was beginning to splinter in every possible direction. Freddy began to fully materialize as he struggled his way from within it. Each section of his body stretched and moved in unnatural directions like an insect would do, the room now becoming distorted in its dimensions as the roof slowly morphed and extended outwards into nothingness and infinite space, the wood of my bed creaking from an immense weight that only he possessed. And then his mask started shifting between a man and the classic character I'm sure we all know about. He wasn't smiling like he usually did, but he made the weirdest gurgling sound, and I looked past his mangled and decaying face, only to see the toys around my room now alive as well, their vacant button eyes staring at me, their mouths opening with tiny, razor-sharp teeth. He grabbed a teddy bear, pulled out the stuffing, and watched it with what I would almost consider morbid curiosity, its vacant, dark black eyes still looking at me. Then he turned back, a wet chuckle replacing his guttural breathing, and spoke a variation of my favorite lullaby, but broken up in such a way that made me feel that the sound was something inherently awful. I remember my legs shaking trying to get away when the ground under my feet started turning into a deep and dark mud, and there was not a thing that I could do, just stare as he and the things around my room slowly encroached before all went black as those razor blades made contact with my face. Not with cutting precision, but slow, dragging agony as he spoke. Once again, my lullaby as the darkness came forth. I woke up then in a cold sweat and was just in shock from it, that he was able to pull those memories and made such an unnatural and weird alteration of them that truly terrified me. In the worst part, the lullaby felt different now. Every time I even just slightly remember its sound, every word I know by heart is being corrupted and defiled.
Next was a completely jarring experience. I was in a carnival that at first felt a little odd, but ultimately good, and it started to give a feeling of a very comfortable summer that I never had. Everything had a saturated orange hue that slowly shifted between colors before going to more and more deep tones. All around me, there were bright flashing lights and the sweet aroma of popcorn mixed with cotton candy. As the area seemed bigger, I started making my way around towards a section that I didn't remember being in the old areas, and noticed all kinds of strange but cute attractions. Everything in here was way too happy, and as a dark feeling sunk, I started turning towards a different area of the fun park. My steps were very loud on the pavement. I was getting scared by it before noticing all of a sudden in my vision, dozens upon dozens of funhouse mirrors began appearing from nowhere surrounding me, reflecting me over and over from infinite directions, each one a little bit warped and contorted, each version moving slightly out of sync as I took slow breaths to contain the ever-present dread. That is when he appeared from inside my reflection, and I remember that this time he wasn't a grotesque, decaying figure. His clothing felt well-made and pressed, as if this carnival was one of his possessions. He smiled as always, a crooked and sharp-toothed grin from his mouth. He wasn't saying anything. He just continued looking straight towards me, staring from my distorted reflections as the mirrors became closer. Then his grin shifted slowly from simple smiling to one of madness, like the whole concept of human emotions was being perverted with every movement. And I tried backing away from the mirror, but in doing so, my feet dragged in such a way that started cracking my reflections, making all kinds of weird, broken versions of myself. His movements became more animated. He seemed delighted by the pain in my reflection, the razors appearing in his hands as my legs sunk into the ground, and my broken self reflected the broken ground below him. The sound his nails made upon scraping the mirrors, like someone was taking metal files upon thin, brittle bone, was something I can never forget. Each broken self had its eyes locked upon me, his evil grin never wavering, and the world slowly melted into that horrid and unholy crimson darkness. I still shudder every time I glance into my own reflection after that night. The carnival noises still echo in my head sometimes.
This final nightmare was completely unnerving. The sheer sense of scale was more overwhelming than any place I have ever been. This was not somewhere that was inside a place I had in my mind. It was something else completely that had its own structure, as something like it felt inherently old. I walked and walked through tall ceilings, rows and rows of endless shelves stacked high with books, and all of them were either blank or completely dark, with only shadows, which felt extremely isolating, as if there was never life in this place. The library itself was completely different than everything else. Instead of decaying like before, there was a very clean, pristine tone about this building, as it almost looked like it was newly built. There wasn't anything broken, and everything had an ordered sense to them that made everything seem off, like the place wasn't just old, but the kind of ancient that it predated time, and it just stood in a point completely isolated. I started looking for an exit or something to focus on when he finally emerged between one of the shelves as the books disappeared all around him as he spoke directly in my mind. And this is why it felt different from the past occurrences, because all he said was the things that my doubts say. My fears materialized in perfect words directly in my brain as all of his words resonated within me. I was in complete agony. He was tormenting my existence. There weren't any laughs, any threats, only the worst aspects of me now materialized into something very cruel. His claws made contact in my arms in perfect cuts that did not kill me immediately, but filled every single moment of its pain. And he proceeded to walk back into his shadows in perfect order, like the whole building and everyone and every item that was around it were all his properties. As my world melted again into crimson, all of his awful words slowly faded into a high-pitched hum that stayed within me. Sometimes, if there is enough quiet, I can still hear his voice echoing even in waking hours. The dread is the worst of it, because no one would be able to help if these become completely physical. Even now, he is here, just below.
My first truly unnerving experience in this new wave of nightmares started in a setting that was familiar, my old neighborhood. But everything felt off-kilter. The houses were slightly too close together, the trees were gnarled and twisted like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky, and the sky was an unsettling shade of bruised purple. The streetlights flickered erratically, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. Everything was drenched in this sickly, sweet smell of burnt sugar and rot. I remember the sounds being very muted. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my own breaths and the ever so slightly sound of something else that seemed to be moving way off in the distance. Then the ground started to crack under my feet, and all around me these black, oily-looking cracks started to form in the floor of my old street. The closer the cracks became, the more I could hear that sound from the distance, which started to get closer and closer to me. That's when I saw him. He wasn't lurking in the shadows, he was part of them. His form was indistinct, like he was made of the darkness itself, with only the glint of his razors and the faint red glow of his eyes giving away his presence. His movements were unsettlingly fluid, almost like he was slipping between dimensions. He didn't laugh or make those cheesy quips that I remembered. Instead, he spoke in a low, guttural tone that sounded like the earth itself was groaning. He didn't threaten me, but whispered things that were the worst aspects of myself that I had locked away, like he was slowly peeling my very being and laying it in front of me. His voice shifted between a raspy whisper to the familiar, gravelly tone that I knew before. He started to move towards me as those cracks came closer. The blades became sharper in my vision as he seemed to be moving through the floor itself, and the world started to get very warped as I tried to run, only to find that I couldn't move a single muscle. Every aspect of my body was being slowly paralyzed. As he came closer, the street started to buckle and twist with his steps, forming itself to his very shape, and his body became more and more clear. My world turned to a red hue as I felt his claws drag across my face, with each cut feeling like the worst possible pain. This wasn't like the movies. This was real, agonizing pain that felt like it was tearing at my very soul. The sound that he made after this felt very alien. It was almost like he was pleased by it.
The next nightmare was even more complex and disorienting. I was trapped in what appeared to be a giant clockwork mechanism. The walls were made of brass gears, constantly moving and grinding, and the air was thick with the smell of oil and metal. The light was dim and flickering, casting long, distorted shadows that made the whole place feel like it was breathing. I was running endlessly through this maze of gears and pipes, always feeling like I was a step behind something or someone as my body grew more and more tired. The sounds of the machine were constant, a deafening cacophony of clicks, whirs, and hisses that made my head spin, making it hard to focus on my goal. Every corner I went into felt like a new part of the maze that I have already been to. It was a place that didn't make any sense, and yet was completely linear. Then I saw him. This time he was different again. He had these elaborate gears embedded in his skin. His movements were jerky and mechanical, and his razor glove was modified to look like a clock hand that was spinning slowly. Its blades covered in a black, oily substance, and the blades themselves were now made of brass. His face was paler than usual, and his eyes had a cold, calculating glint that sent shivers down my spine. He was silent, but the way his eyes stared into my very soul was 1,000 times worse. He pursued me through the labyrinth, and every time I thought I had created some space between us, he would suddenly appear in front of me. Each time his body looked more and more like the actual labyrinth itself. He didn't try to cut me. Instead, he seemed to delight in toying with me, forcing me through this endless maze, pushing me further and further into exhaustion as my world started to fall apart. He seemed more like some kind of sadistic warden or mechanic than the same monster from the movies. His body was beginning to shift into that of the clock as he became more and more robotic, and at the end, the very gears started to crush me to nothingness. Then all turned to red. I woke up with my body feeling broken and my head still hurting from the sheer volume of that clockwork machine.
Most recently, my nightmare took an even darker turn. I found myself in a vast art gallery, but every painting and sculpture was grotesque and nightmarish. The portraits had eyes that followed you. The landscapes were warped and distorted, and the sculptures were made of twisted human figures. Every step was very deliberate, as I did not want to touch any of them, but they were all getting very close to me. It felt like this entire place was designed to make me lose my mind. The air was heavy with the smell of old paint and an undercurrent of decay. I was feeling sick to my stomach with each step, as if the gallery itself was alive and growing closer to me. The closer I went into the gallery, the longer the distances felt to walk through them. Then, Freddy stepped out of a portrait, his body contorted and grotesque, like he was a creature made of brushstrokes and shadows. This version of him was more artistic. His razor glove was replaced by paintbrushes, and his clothes had splatters of various colors all over. He seemed almost proud of the place as he admired the horrific art that he had displayed to me. He started to speak with an air of arrogance as he showed me his most prized pieces. All the while, his face started to contort into that of an actual painting, moving around in a very unnatural way. He began to paint on me with his bloody brushes, each stroke bringing some form of awful, twisted image into reality. The gallery started to move around me, the paintings changing as if to represent the pain I was in. All the while, he wasn't laughing. He just continued to paint as he reveled in the agony he was causing, like he was a conductor of this horrible symphony of suffering. Then the last thing I saw before the crimson was my own portrait that I was now part of. I could see the suffering and pain that I have felt, immortalized for all eternity in this awful place. I fear the next night because he changes more and more every time.
My latest nightmare began with a sensation of intense heat. I found myself in a place that was a bizarre blend of factory and abattoir. The walls were made of rusted metal and dripping pipes, the floor slick with a viscous, reddish-brown liquid, and the air thick with the stench of decay and burnt flesh. The place was dimly lit with flickering, incandescent bulbs, casting long, distorted shadows that made the grotesque machinery look like living, breathing monsters. Everywhere I looked, there was something moving. Conveyor belts carried what looked like raw meat, and all kinds of machines pounded, sliced, twisted, and mashed it into different shapes. Everything in this place was made of flesh. The floor, the walls, the machines. Everything was alive. The sounds here were something else. The metallic screeching and hammering was combined with the wet, sickening squelching of flesh being processed. It felt very unnatural, and as if every sound was trying to rip me apart. I walked carefully through the space, trying not to make any sudden moves that would draw too much attention, as I heard the soft patter of something slowly moving behind me. Then, he emerged from behind a massive meat-grinding machine. This version of Freddy was unlike anything I had seen before. His skin was a patchwork of different textures, some areas burned, others raw and exposed, and still others covered with thick, fibrous tissue. His razor glove was no longer just metal. The blades were now fashioned from what looked like bone, some with jagged edges, others that looked like serrated teeth. He wasn't smiling. Instead, he had this unnerving expression of almost clinical fascination, as if he was a butcher observing a new cut of meat. He began to speak with a deep, guttural tone that almost seemed to vibrate throughout my very being. Every single word felt like an awful violation. He didn't threaten me directly, but instead, he began to explain each and every aspect of that awful factory as I was dragged closer towards a conveyor belt that had chains waiting to drag me down to the grinders. I tried to resist, but he was like some kind of master foreman, controlling every aspect of the factory as each machine became closer to my body. Every single cut of those bone blades felt like a lifetime of agony. As the world turned to crimson, I remember the sounds of the grinding machine tearing my body and bones into shreds. I woke up screaming, my body drenched in sweat, and the stench of decay still lingering in my nose.
The subsequent nightmare was a dramatic shift in setting, but no less horrific. I was in a grand, ornate opera house, but it was decaying and dilapidated. The plush velvet seats were torn and moth-eaten, the gilded balconies were crumbling, and the grand chandelier was hanging precariously by a single chain. The air was thick with the scent of dust and old, dried blood, as it felt like something horrible happened in this place. The only sound here was a faint, discordant music box tune that felt like it was coming from all around me at once, as it grew louder and louder with each passing moment. The colours were faded and muted, as if the entire building was slowly fading away. As I tried to leave the opera house, I was met with the endless hallways and doors which brought me back to the very same place. I noticed the walls of this area changing every time I passed through them. The very place was playing with my mind. Then he appeared on the stage, spotlighted by a single beam of light. This Freddy was more theatrical, dressed in a tattered tuxedo, with his burned face obscured by a cracked porcelain mask. He moved with this unnatural grace, almost like a deranged dancer. His razor glove was replaced by a conductor's baton with sharp blades at the tip, and he was directing the awful music with every single movement. As he began to conduct, I felt the floor moving underneath my feet, and then the music became louder and louder with each passing second. He didn't speak, but instead he started conducting the very building, making the walls twist and the floor buckle. I felt the entire opera house shaking and twisting around me as he began his performance. Every single motion seemed to be directed to me, as if he was the one making my body twist and turn in unnatural ways. All of this ended with the chandeliers falling down upon me as my body was torn apart by the now corrupted music box. The red came quickly as the sounds of the opera house echoed in my ears after I woke up in terror.
My most recent and perhaps most disturbing nightmare took place in a beautiful garden. It was filled with vibrant flowers and lush greenery, but everything was subtly wrong. The flowers were all slightly too vibrant, the trees were twisted and gnarled, and the air was heavy with a sickly sweet fragrance that made my stomach churn. This was a place that felt both beautiful and awful. Everything looked too perfect and too pristine, like no life could ever occur in this place. The more I looked at it, the worse I felt. The silence here was also deafening, as if everything was holding its breath. That's when I saw him, or rather, pieces of him. This time, Freddy wasn't a single entity, but fragmented memories, bits and pieces of himself scattered throughout the garden. His burned face floated in a pond, his razor glove was hidden amongst thorns, and his laugh echoed faintly from behind the trees. Every aspect of him became its own separate entity, but they were all linked to one another. I noticed this when every piece of him turned to look at me. It felt as if they were all watching me at once, and he began to speak in unison, every aspect of his voice merging into this unholy mess of a tone. He didn't attack directly, but instead, he forced me to interact with the pieces of himself, making me touch his burned skin, pull his razor glove, and listen to his haunting laughter as each action corrupted every memory I have ever had of this beautiful place, and replacing it with his own personal hell. The garden started to twist itself, as if all the memories that were in this place were coming to life with every action I performed. This ended with the pieces of him closing in on me, as if they were dragging me into himself as the world turned to crimson. I now fear to sleep. It's getting worse every night, and I'm afraid that he is finally going to break me.